I want to give you an overview around Backstage. So the initial question is, when we look at Backstage and Backstage's slogan, I find it very interesting, because what they actually say is, we want happy developers, because happy developers make happy code. That's an interesting statement, right? So it's kind of developer happiness, developer satisfaction, those sort of things, which made it interesting to me. It's like, why did they put up that slogan? But if we look into the story later on, we better understand what actually was driving it. And driving the whole conversation is the challenges around software is still eating the world. You're probably very well familiar with that slide deck. You can almost pick it up on a daily basis because it's changing so fast. It's the cloud CNCF landscape with all the different initiatives, projects, etc. You know it very well. And it's always too difficult for a developer to understand each of these boxes in depth and understand and keep track what is changing, interact within my environment. How do I just simply deploy my new app into a different network segment or somewhere else in another location? I always have to consider, like, how did we do it there? What's the implementation? How does the interface look like? What languages to use? So it's very difficult. The whole ecosystem and the whole stack is very complex. And at the end, what is causing that? Well, all the trends around microservices and like the different subset of tools. I covered that one. At the end, what it actually does, it causes friction. And the friction, or even fragmentation, if you want to call it, is affecting the developer happiness. And interesting there was when Spotify reviewed the developer happiness, they understood they have to address it. And I want to give you a quick recap what Spotify did. So for that, we have to go back into the year 2016. 2016, Spotify was in hyper growth mode. I really missed my clicker here. It wasn't hyper growth mode. It was changing from just a streaming app to like individualized provider of software and how you can consume music. So it was dramatically changing. And because of that hyper growth they were experiencing, they had to onboard more and more developers fairly quickly. Speed to market, right? They said, okay, we have to address this new customer base. We have to adopt our application and make sure it fits our customers. Now, at the end, they understood the developer effectiveness was going down. Interesting thing, right? So they were in hypergrowth, they had a lot of new customers, they had a lot of new developers, but the effectiveness went down. And it's interesting how they actually measure it. And I was like reviewing some of the blogs and the information around Spotify and how they did it. Actually, they have a KPI for it. And the KPI is for a new developer joining the company, joining Spotify. The metric is how many days does it take for a developer from the start date until his 10th pull request. So how many days does it take for him to do 10 pull requests? And it suddenly went up to about 60 days. So they were grabbing new developers, and until they actually did the 10th commit or pull request even, 60 days. And then they do something. We have to understand what is going wrong. Why does it take them so long to actually bring value to the table? What is slowing them down? What they did, they basically said, we have to have a developer portal. That's when they looked and reviewed and talked to those developers. They said, well, the most challenging thing is the onboarding. How does a developer find access to what tools do we have? What services already exist? What ecosystem do we have? What is even available to actually develop code? Now, what they did, they created back then Backstage. It was created at Spotify. We already spoiled that quite some while ago. And it was then later on donated to the CNCF community. And a question to the audience here: what do you think when Spotify actually created Backstage? Anyone would want to give an educated guess which year it could have been when they started with Backstage? 2016. Thank you. Spot on. You were listening to me. Thank you so much. So it is actually very interesting that it's not a new thing. Even though we heard it in the community, heard it on the market, we all thought like probably, well, it's the new kid from the block, but it actually has quite some history. So it's 2016. Spot on. Second question: when got it donated to the CNCF community? 2019. Anyone else want to get a closer guess? 2020. We got a winner. There is your mug. It was 2020. Sorry, you will get your chance, but you already have the socks, right? So it has it already has some time in, right? It's not a totally new thing. It actually has some history with Spotify, but now even within the market. Now I've mentioned developer portal. What does it mean, right? Or it's even sometimes referred as an IDP, internal developer portal. So what is that term actually? What do we mean by that? Or what does the industry mean by that? Well, first of all, it is one front end for your entire infrastructure, for your whole ecosystem. It's like kind of a one-stop shop as a developer. If I start somewhere, I want to go in and I want to find everything I need. I want to create new projects. I want to know what is available already, probably roam around and find documentations. So that would be my totally happy developer face saying, cool, that's it. That's how I can bring value and start committing code into the environment. So like I said, unified, a single UI. That would be awesome, right? All the tooling, CI/CD. Where does it run? Is it Kubernetes? How do we monitor it? How do we do all the security and patch management? All that questions. But so basically abstracting the infrastructure layer away from the developer, so they can just focus on what is important to them, developing code. When Spotify did it, they said we have to remember three things, and we have to somewhat bring those three things into consideration. And one was about speed, right? We want to have speed without compromising the safety. Secondly, it was scale. They want to say we want to scale without compromising the quality. We want to make sure the quality still is up. And lastly, we want to control that chaos of friction, of fragmented tools, and the whole chaotic software ecosystem they have. That's why they built Spotify. Now, if we take a look at that, that is an actual screenshot of Backstage at Spotify. Pretty interesting, looks nice to me. I mean, we have a fancy navigation menu. We're going to find different things. We have quick access with toolbox. You have a huge search box in the center. And I think that makes it out. It's like, okay, where do I start off as a developer? What am I looking for? So it's about like finding information. It's about creating new value. We're going to see that later on. But that brings me exactly to the points I just mentioned. It's like, what can Backstage bring? I can start creating things. I go in, I'll find some templates, right? I want to say I want to build a backend application or something. I have a template, I create a new project, and within that template, everything is defined what I need, including CI/CD, including the whole security checks, where it's running, all the monitoring, everything is done for me. So even the manage section, so once I created and crafted something new, I want to make sure that I keep track of it. How do I manage this application now? Manage in the sense of on which clusters is it running, or how do I address security needs? How do I patch like Log4j or anything else? We have tons of them. And lastly, it's about explore. I think the statement I just made around the search box. I just came in as a developer. I am responsible for both backend development. How do I know how we at Spotify or any other company define the architecture, the standards around backend applications? So I can go in, I can find my ecosystem, I can find the details how to develop, how things are connected together, and easily start the coding of an application. So when we look at the attributes of a developer portal, I think it's an interesting statement also, which came from Spotify, is we want to lower the cognitive load of a developer. So again, it's about like taking load of them, but also in the mindset sense, right? How do we make sure all my brain time is spent well on developing code and not like thinking about how do I write a YAML file for Kubernetes and how do I expose the service and what about monitoring, and yet there was something about backup. So all these with a centric view for developers, abstracting again the underlying technology, and lastly, increasing time to value. How do they do it? What's the golden recipe of Spotify? They defined the golden path. That's even an interesting read for some of you. If you're interested, the references at the bottom is a separate blog entry from Spotify, how they actually do and why they do the golden path, why they strongly believe as a success factor for that. So they understood because of the different teams they have, and each team had different pipelines, each team had different tooling, every team basically did their own thing, and at the end they understood things don't connect to each other anymore. They're disconnected. And then they had to find out like how can we sort that out, and there too many time was spent on fixing those things. So they went in and said the golden idea and golden thing is to have golden paths, or even we call it within VMware as path to production. It's not like necessarily in the sense of a CI/CD technical implementation, how to do things. It's also a cultural thing. Like how do we work together? How do I find things? How do we exchange ideas? So you're going to see later on the demo as well is like what is meant with that. It's even the philosophy of whenever you develop something, you also document it within the same style, and Backstage will actually present it for you in a readable manner. So all that cultural things, and even how do we exchange information, and like for example, which Slack group is responsible for that application or that service, you can easily find there and start contributing in that way. Perfect. So this is the way how we do it. Now, question to you guys, who says this is the way all the time? Anyone volunteering? Like, what is the famous reference? Yay! Hooray! Congrats! Awesome. What was the answer? The Mandalorian. Great, thank you. Thank you for staying with us. That's great. So the role of developer portals, what is it? It's a hub of collaboration. Like I just said, you're not necessarily responsible as a service owner to document everything in 100% and then to be blamed if something is missing. Everything is in a manner of contribution, collaboration. So if I, as a new developer, come in and I see, well, there's something obviously wrong in the documentation, I'll just contribute to it. I'll just make a pull request and say, I'm going to fix it. There's something missing, or it's wrong, So it's really supporting the collaboration within the developers and across the teams. Now, beforehand, I mentioned the plugin ecosystem. So what is interesting with Backstage? Backstage per se is, if you just install it, there is very little value, if I would say. The value is within the ecosystem, within the plugins you can have, and you can connect them. So Backstage itself, if you just install it, it's just an empty portal. The benefit is actually that you really can use plugins, and those plugins it's tremendous scaling in the sense of how many new plugins are available. So I would say any famous vendor you know has probably built already a plugin for Backstage. So the idea is you use Backstage as a standard, and then you add those things as a plugin which are relevant for your company. And you don't have a huge thing which hundreds of integrations you probably never need. Backstage is open source. That's a strong commitment of Spotify. They also said it is such a great thing we want to do. And I think they were even doing it kind of, well, first of all, they're bragging around the whole thing, right? And I think they can brag around it because they have really good service. They have a huge community. So for example, you have 6 hours for a merge contribution. It only takes 6 hours. You got 1 day to resolve an issue. And they're like growing like hell. They have 11 new contributors every week. And just if we look at those figures, it's amazing how fast it's growing, consider them just being here and around for 2 years. But Backstage, or even Spotify said, we have to open source it because we have to be the first. Because if we have to have it open sourced first, others will start using it, and we don't have the risk to maintain our own thing, and probably something else makes it the standard, and then we probably have to adapt because our developers don't like it. So they kind of did it in that sense to make sure it's here and come to stay. So another question here, how many contributors you think are already in Backstage in that project? Anyone want to give a guess? No one? 400. We have 400. Do we got more? Sold. No, not yet. Not yet. Anyone else? How many contributors do you think are already part of that project? 2,000? 3,000? Well, I think they're pretty soon there. It's 1,500, counting every week. You will do. Awesome. Thank you. Who was the closest one with 2,000? Perfect. Thank you. Awesome. So Backstage's success is clearly seen in those figures. It's seeing how many new contributions are happening, how many new adopters and plugins are coming into that ecosystem. So we truly think this is the next big thing. And it's even interesting how Spotify actually drives that project. They only have 6 people driving that project within Spotify. So it's not like there are hundreds of developers looking after that. It is really driven through the community. And obviously within internal, because of their culture, how to drive the portal itself. What was also interesting for me is like to understand like, okay, who is using it? It's always nice to see such fancy technologies, but at the end, it's always the big, large banks or some huge organizations in the US. But is it really relevant for us, or can we tie it to a specific industry or country? And I haven't found it. So actually, if I look at the organizations, it's independent. There is like literally every industry is in. So you can't nail it down and say it's only the banks or only, I don't know, the big tech companies which are actually using it. What I want to give you as a reading on for later on is like a demo option for the Backstage open source version of it. So demo.backstage.io is the official demo option for Backstage. You will get the slides anyway, but yeah, go ahead and capture the QR code. That's one interesting thing to just play around and understand like what is the idea behind how they actually did it. And really hot off the press, that is just 2 weeks old, is a free Backstage course within CNCF. So it is about introducing Backstage to, in the sense of how these portals can be used and developers. I can highly recommend that. That's really just 2 weeks old. You can see it in the bottom. It's like from 15th of November. So just a new thing, just to play around, get your own point of view in case you haven't already installed it like a third of the group in here. And it's like timing-wise, roughly 8 to 10 hours. So it's not like you have to spend years on it. There is more readings available, like how can you contribute, what is the community, what plugins are already available, stuff like that. So please later on go ahead. Even within our own conference, we just did a few weeks back, VMware Explore, we had held, together with Suzanne Daniels from Spotify, we held a session, which is also recorded, just in case you want to hear like how they tell you the story and like what was driving Suzanne and her team. So hear directly from Spotify, not just me telling you the story again. Yeah. But with that, I think I gave you a hopefully good overview. What we now want to do is we want to see Backstage in action. I think Ben is already waiting to show us, and yeah, I can see him smiling.
Stefan, thank you so much. What a cool introduction, and yeah, great talk. Thank you. There's a load of information in there that I hadn't come across before, so I'm looking forward to digging into the recording a little bit more and maybe catching the beginning. But yeah, thanks very much for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about Backstage and how we have essentially incorporated it into what we're doing here at VMware. So let me share my screen. I have like the minimum number possible of slides. So I'll just give you a slide or two, and then we'll take a look around a demo. So let's have a look. Hopefully you can see my screen. I'm going to show you this quick disclaimer. This is just because the stuff that we're working on today, especially Backstage and the work that we're doing around what we call the Tanzu application platform GUI, is very fluid. It's a work in progress. It's iterating very quickly. And there might be some things that I mentioned today that are not yet in the product, or that might not ultimately appear in the product in future. So with that in mind, here's a disclaimer. So what is our interpretation of the golden path, right? You heard Stefan talking about the golden path. Our interpretation is that it should provide the optimum route through many of the obstacles facing developer, security, and platform teams alike. So we're not just concentrating on developers purely, we're also thinking about the needs of other teams as well. And we're looking at the whole ecosystem, the whole life cycle from beginning to end, and all the interactions that need to happen for not only developers to be happy, but also for security teams to be happy and for platform teams to also be happy at the same time. And we think that breaks down into three rough areas. And in the demo in a second, I'm going to show you some of the things that we've done in those areas in the Tanzu application platform that happen to be surfaced through the Backstage GUI that we have in the platform. So the three areas that we think are important are: how do folks get started? So how do they begin new code? How do they follow the patterns that are already established within their organization and contribute to those patterns as well? And how do they consume APIs that are already within that particular organization? And other things too, like how do you train someone who's new, or how do you enhance the knowledge of folks who've been there for a while but we're moving towards new technologies? You know, how do you share information about those new technologies amongst teams? Bearing in mind that we're VMware, right? So we talk to organizations with literally hundreds of developer teams, sometimes spread all across the world as well, in lots of different geographies. They're all perhaps working in different business units. We see it all. We see the largest of the large organizations right the way down to the kind of medium and even small organizations in some cases as well. So we have a lot of experience of trying to help folks get over the challenges that they have with running developer teams. Same when running software. So, you know, how does your software actually run? How does it get to production? How do you see what's in production? How do you debug and troubleshoot that stuff that you have running in production? How do you share knowledge about the context in which everyone's working? And again, this is something that we think Backstage is perfectly positioned to help us to deliver a better experience to these teams as they work through their daily lives on the Tanzu application platform. And lastly, how do you manage code? So, you've got your code into production, but how do you manage it? How do you make sure that it stays secure, for example? That's a really, really big challenge for a lot of organizations. They don't want to mess about with your data. They are very, very worried about the threat that comes from outside, and they want to make sure that they can prove that they have as secure a footing as possible at any moment in time, any time, day or night. They want to be able to prove that they are as secure as they can possibly be. They also want to stay healthy. So, they want the level of the quality of service that they offer to be high. And they also want to stay up to date. They don't want to have software that goes so far out of date that it becomes a liability, i.e. less secure. So we think start, run, manage is roughly 3 areas where we can help with the Tanzu application platform, which runs on top of Kubernetes, but also where our interpretation of the Backstage UI can also help the teams who are involved in these 3 things to get through their daily work and be able to do it productively, because we know that productive teams are also happy teams. So that's our goal. So let's have a look at a quick demo. So I'm going to start off with Backstage, as it happens. You heard Stefan talking about the Backstage demo. Here it is, right? So this is vanilla Backstage, open source Backstage, straight out of the box. And you'll notice that it looks very similar. I'll show you the Tanzu application platform in a second, but it looks very similar. There's a very similar sort of navigation layout. There are even some things that look extremely similar, like the settings page, for example. So if I switch over to Tanzu application platform, this is our GUI, and the settings page is very similar. So we've got the same options around, which theme you would like to apply, the profile, the authentication providers, etc. So already you can see that we are clearly based on Backstage, and there is no doubt about that. We love Backstage. We're very supportive of it, and we are actively participating in that community and contributing our ideas and our code back to the Backstage project as well. So we love Backstage, we think it's great, and we are using it actively inside some of our flagship products like Tanzu application platform. We also have a similar thing here with the catalog. The Backstage catalog is there. We also have the same sort of thing in Tanzu application platform, but it has been expanded. We've done some extra things to the catalog that are pretty unique to the Tanzu application platform and that allow folks to get more context about the applications that they're running on Kubernetes and where they live and how they're operating. And then some other things that you'll notice is, for example, a system view. System view exists in Backstage. It also exists in the Tanzu application platform. You can go through, find a particular system, get a diagram all about that system, find all the components that are communicating and collaborating in delivering that particular service to customers, and you can view the same sort of graphs and stuff. We can do that also through regular Backstage. So if I have a look at this system here, for example, take a look at the diagram. It's very, very similar, same sort of stuff. Okay, so that's vanilla Backstage. This is Tanzu application platform. Let's start looking at some of the things that are slightly different, and the Tanzu application platform has been designed to try and deliver to teams to help them stay productive. One of the things that Stefan was talking about was, how do teams get started? How do they actually, first of all, get started on a piece of code, but also how do they share things like patterns, etc., amongst themselves and with other teammates? And we've designed application accelerators to help us do that. Now, accelerators themselves are custom, so our clients can write their own accelerators. I've got a selection here of about 15 or so, but there's no limit. You could have as many as you wanted, and they can cover as many different programming languages as you like as well. The idea with each one of these is that they provide a template. So each one of these tiles on this screen here is a template for a particular type of project. If I choose one, for example, if I go for this RESTful web app here, for example, I can take a look at that. It allows me to pre-configure this particular template, and then I can click next. It asks me if I want to create a Git repository. I'm not going to in this particular case, but you can. And then it would allow me to generate that particular accelerator as well. When I generate it, it's now creating for me all the code that I need to get started with that particular piece of project. I can also explore what's been generated for me. So this is good because it gives me the opportunity to show to you folks all the work that's gone on in the background to create this template ready for a developer to use. And the template itself is quite comprehensive. This particular one is a Java web app. So I'm using the Maven packaging system, and everything that I need, all the packages that my organization thinks we should use are contributed to this particular piece of source code already. So I've got dependencies for database access, for metrics, for web access, for things like REST. It's all here already. It's also done some things like creating a Docker Compose file so that if I want to test locally, I can do. I also have in here source code, so I can quickly take a look at the source code that's been generated for me. Oh, pardon me. Just click that carefully. There we go. Clicked it carefully enough this time. I've got all the usual stuff, including an API definition. So out of the box, I've got an API definition that follows the OpenAPI 3 specification. I also have some things that help me with Backstage. For example, a catalog file, which allows my application to be listed in the catalog that we saw earlier. And then I've also got some configuration. This particular item, this workload YAML, this describes this workload so that the Tanzu application platform can just take this one file and this source code and build and run the application on the platform for me without me having to really generate any YAML like RESTful, replica sets or deployments or any of that stuff. The services, I don't need to write all the usual YAML for all that stuff. It's going to generate all that for me because I've got one of these files that defines how this workload runs. So yeah, there's a whole ton of stuff here, and this can be written by anyone. So any team can provide an accelerator that could help themselves or any other team inside the organization to use the same patterns, to use the same libraries, to use the same conventions. All of that stuff can be captured. All that great knowledge can be captured and publicized inside these accelerators that live inside the platform. In addition to that, we've also got the API navigator that allows you to take a look at the APIs that are offered inside your organization. If I drill down into some of these, you can see the full OpenAPI specification for one of the components that's been deployed onto the platform. This can happen automatically too. If your application defines an OpenAPI spec, then it can be picked up by the platform as the workload is run and added to this list of APIs automatically. So there's very little that you need to do as a developer in order to make this happen. But it gives you the usual kind of Swagger definitions. You'll be able to go through and find out what the different payloads are, for example, and all the different endpoints and which methods to use in order to work with those endpoints as well. So a whole bunch of stuff around APIs in here too. Let's move on to the run aspect. Remember, we're talking about sort of start, run, and manage. Let's take a look at run now. So how do workloads get onto the platform? They go through a supply chain. Now, a supply chain is a secure pipeline, if you like, that takes a piece of source code and turns it into a running application running inside of Kubernetes. And that's what all these applications here, they've all been through a supply chain. So if I just pick one off, say I look at this gateway here, this particular supply chain is quite good, I think. It's got a lot of stuff in here, so I'll talk you very quickly through the whole lot. So we have the source provider. This is a trigger, if you like. It's watching GitHub and it's waiting for changes on a particular piece of source code. And then as soon as those changes appear, it will take the code, check it out, and run a test on it. And this test varies. So if you're running Java, it would run tests in a Java fashion. If you're running Python, it will run tests in a Python fashion. So it's very flexible. You can use the same supply chain for lots of different things. Then once that's passed and the application is almost ready to be built, we'll go through a security scanner. So we'll run some scanning on the source code to find out what are the dependencies inside this piece of source code and what vulnerabilities do they have. And there's quite a few vulnerabilities listed out for this particular piece of source code here, but it also gives you a mechanism to go and check those, and I'll show you that in a little while. Then it will build an image for us. So we don't need a Docker file. The application can automatically be built into an OCI compliant container, and it will use a hardened operating system inside that container as well to limit as far as possible all the security vulnerabilities and prevent us from having that sort of sprawl that you get when every team's got a different Docker file. So we're using an open source CNCF project called build packs to do this. Go and take a look at build packs if you haven't before. I highly recommend it. They are way, way, way easier to use than Docker files. What else do we have? This image, of course, added an operating system. So we have an image scanner. In this case, it's Gripe, but we also have integrations with others like Sneak, for example. This is checking the layers in the OCI image to make sure that there haven't been any vulnerabilities introduced by the operating system or any of the sort of sub layers of the image. Once we know that's okay, we go through config provider and application config, where essentially we're starting to build all the information needed to run the application on Kubernetes. And then we also check for any service bindings. So if there are anything like databases that need to be configured to connect to this particular application, then we can do that in the service bindings. And then finally, we go through API descriptors to add any APIs automatically to the API list that we saw earlier, and then the config writer. Config writer is creating all the configuration needed to run this particular application on Kubernetes. It will use, for example, things like it will have all the usual Kubernetes stuff in there. So everything that you're used to with when you're running an application manually on Kubernetes, you know, you're configuring things like the result sets and the services and all that sort of stuff. It's got all of that ready to go before finally it's turned into a workload and then delivered onto the platform. Once it's delivered, then it's running, and the application will receive a URL. So you provide Tanzu application platform with some source code, and you will get a URL for that running workload as soon as it's ready. And that's a supply chain. We think that supply chains are really important. They're a way that teams can get that sustainable pace that they need, because they can hand off source code to a supply chain. The supply chain will take care of the rest. But at the same time, it's also very secure. Operators and security teams can help to create these supply chains. They're very flexible, so they integrate with lots of different tools. and you can have different application source code types go through the same supply chain as well if you want to. So you could have one supply chain that does Java and Node and .NET, or you could have different supply chains to treat those things differently. It's entirely up to you. Behind the scenes, there's an open source project called Cartographer, and that is helping bind all this stuff together, provides us with the mechanism that we need to link all these different stages in the supply chain together. So that's supply chains. I'm going to try and hurry up now because I know you folks in the room have been very patient while we had those technical issues, and we've gone over slightly. So I'll try and speed up a little bit. But what I did want to show you was how you take a look at what is running on the platform right now. So what is in Kubernetes? What physical pieces are running in the cloud somewhere that are related to my application? So if I go through and take a look at the gateway, I have this tab here for runtime resources. And in this runtime resources, I can now see all the different items that are associated with this particular workload. If I take a look at the pod, then I can see, for example, everything that was applied in order to get that pod to run. So I've got my workload deliverable, I've got the service, I've got the deployment, I've got the replica set, I've got the pod itself. I can also see the logs for the pod, so I can take a look. If I think there's something that I need to see in the log, I can go and have a look at the log. I can even change the log levels live, so I could maybe go and change the web package up to debug rather than info where it currently is. So I can start to interact with the application as it's running on the platform as well. Let's take a look at something else. So if I go through the Knative service, inside this platform is Knative. Knative allows us to, it's another CNCF project, allows us to scale to 0. You probably know that already. But this is where I'll find, for example, my URL for my running workload. So I can start to interact with it and begin to use the application that's been deployed. I can view the YAML that was created in order to drop that onto Kubernetes. And I can take a look at some more information. If I go back to the pod again, I can see live information about what's happening right now on that particular application. So what is its API success rate? How is its environment configured? What variables is it expecting does it have? So for example, here I can see that my config server is living at this particular URI. And I can see which ports have been configured and which JVM is being used for that particular application. Everything you'd expect to know about the environment is here. I've also got HTTP requests. I can look at the different beans that are configured inside this Spring application. I can check the health and see, okay, config server is up. Discovery composite. I'm not using Discovery, so that's good. It's not needed. So yeah, lots and lots of information about the current workload and all the different parts of that workload is all exposed through this UI, which is based on Backstage. Finally, let's take a quick look at 2 more pieces I've got for you. Technical documentation. Again, this exists already on Backstage, so you can see this in the Backstage demo, but it's a, documentation is a nightmare for teams. It can be everywhere. We have documentation in wikis, intranets, Word documents, I don't know, thumb drives. It could be anywhere. I've worked in teams where this kind of sprawl is a real problem, especially for architects as well. If you're trying to piece together all the different pieces of information about a system in order to create something new or design something new, it's an absolute nightmare to go and gather that stuff together, because half of the time, even when you found it on that wiki or intranet, it's 3 years out of date, no longer relevant to what currently happens in the organization. So by exposing your technical documentation alongside your source code, and then through the Backstage UI, you can share that widely amongst all the teams who can get into your Backstage. So they can all share the same contextual information about how the application's been built and how it's run. All that good stuff can be shared more widely, so you can share that knowledge across your teams. And then lastly, how do we manage the applications while they're running? You know, what can we do to help teams to understand, for example, security vulnerabilities that could change on a daily basis? Well, we've added a vulnerability dashboard in here into the UI that gives us a view of all the different applications that are running and where they stand in terms of, do they meet our policy or do they not meet our policy? All the applications here do meet our policy. If any of them didn't, the supply chain would not allow them to be run on the platform. So the policy is applied to the supply chain as well as to this security dashboard that we're seeing here. None of these violate the policy, but if I go through and have a look at one of the components, I know I'll have vulnerabilities on the component because there are always false positives to deal with. You know, CVEs are not it's not black and white. There's a certain amount of gray in there. So I know that, for example, I have this particular CVE on this application. The reason I have it is because of a false positive when the scanner. So we're working with the scanner to improve its detection of these types of applications. But it also allows me to go straight through to the vulnerability database and take a look at that as well. So I think that's it. I think I've shown you all the way around the Tanzu application platform GUI. I think I've shown you how it relates to open source Backstage as well, and the similarities between it. And all that really remains for me to do is to give you a few links for if you want to find out more about our work with Backstage or with the Tanzu application platform itself. You can have a look at our website at via-vmware.com/tap. We've also got some great videos on YouTube. You'll find stuff about supply chains, about debugging and live update, about how to grow your teams, and even how to use Kubernetes to help your teams grow by offering them either accelerators, like I showed you earlier, or maybe through hands-on labs and other things that you can do with your platform as well. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sorry if I had to rush, but I wanted to try and give you as many different opportunities to see all the different parts on the application platform GUI. And hopefully you'll also see it grow. We're investing a lot in this particular area. We have teams working on Backstage and its integration into Tanzu application platform constantly, and it's a fast-moving area. So what I've shown you today will probably look very different in 12 months' time as well, as we continue to double down our investment in this particular area.
Thank you for the presentation. Two quick questions. First is about documentation in Backstage. Does Backstage prescribe the format and location of the documentation, like Markdown in GitHub projects, for instance? And the second question is about the monitoring and deployment features you've shown in Tanzu application platform. If I need to step outside Kubernetes, like provision application load balancers, deploy something to legacy systems, could that be done? Thank you.
Yeah, so I can try and take that if you like. So yeah, the first question was essentially what happens with documentation, right, in the Backstage GUI. So the documentation sorry, I got a lot of feedback there. Can you still hear me? I'm sorry, but I don't think that was me. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So, yeah, I think the first part of the question was what happens with tech docs in Backstage. Backstage has got some great documentation about tech docs, but basically what happens is you provide your technical documentation in a sort of a markdown format. There's a piece of configuration, I think a YAML file or something, that basically sort of describes that documentation where it lives. And then there's a tool that takes that documentation and turns it into the tech docs themselves. And generally they're hosted in something that's AWS bucket compatible, like either AWS or maybe Minio or something similar. So the source code and the documentation can be kept together, but they go through a slightly different build process in order to find their way onto the technical documentation site. And then, sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Going outside of Kubernetes. Yeah, going outside of Kubernetes.
Yeah. So, yeah, full kubectl is available. So if you need to break out of the sort of safe confines of the tooling that we've provided with Tanzu Application Platform, which includes, by the way, a full CLI for interacting with workloads and finding out the status of them and creating them and all that sort of stuff. If you want to work outside of that, you can just work with regular kubectl and regular Kubernetes tools as well.
Awesome, thank you. Any final last question before we get to the beer and the burger?
Oh yeah, don't let me keep you from beer and burger.
Beer and burger, right? It's you in between, Ben.
Oh, I'm gone. I'm gone already. Look, enjoy the rest of your evening. I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions, then I'm on LinkedIn. I really hope you enjoy your beer and your burger. I'm very jealous right now. I wish I was there in person to be able to enjoy that with you. But thanks ever so much for your attendance and your questions and your attention. It's very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. There's a round of applause for you. Thank you so much, and have a great evening. Thanks, Ben.
Cheers. Take care. Bye.
I don't want to spend much time on the recap, right? You know what we heard today. You know what we saw today. I think the biggest important question is, if we go to the very last question or slide, is reach out to us. These are our contact information. Reach out to us. We're even keen now to have the further on conversation. And lastly, if you would be so kind and provide us some feedback, right? That's a very short survey. We want to just give you understand your feedback, and at the end, what we can do better. If you want to hear us again, if you want to hear us next time on a different topic, just give us the feedback. And when you provided the feedback, please just come to Kristen or me, and you can grab your Tanzu swag kit that you look as beautiful as we do.